I don't know if this is advice at all, but you have to embrace your cabbages. That's what I say. I love cabbage and all kinds of cabbage, from like Brussels sprouts to green cabbage to Napa to red to anything. I'm kind of a recent convert. Like I used to only really think of it as slaw in the summer. And then maybe like when I started this whole vegetarian thing, I just became obsessed with roasting it and sauteing it and caramelizing it. And it really is a completely different vegetable. And it's my default for all salads in the winter.
Welcome to Mind, Body, Spirit, Food. I'm your host, Nikki Sizemore, and in this podcast, we explore the rituals, traditions, and cultural influences around food and how food connects us and also sometimes disconnects us to our minds, our bodies, our spirits, the earth, and our communities. This is a space dedicated to bringing more presence, ease, and joy into the process of feeding ourselves. Let's dive in. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the show. So if you have been in a cooking rut, today's guest is here to help. I'm speaking with Jenny Rosenstrach, who is an award-winning food writer. She is the best-selling author of 6 cookbooks, including Dinner, a Love Story, The Weekday Vegetarians, and The Weekday Vegetarians Get Simple. I'm actually giving away a free copy of The Weekday Vegetarians Get Simple, which is her latest book, in the newsletter. So be sure to hop over there so that you can enter to win a free copy. So I don't know about you, but I'm having a bit of a hard time finding inspiration in the kitchen as we head into the deep depths of winter, especially when it comes to cooking with vegetables. Well, Jenny is the queen of weeknight vegetarian cooking. And in today's episode, we dive into cooking with winter produce. We share recipe ideas, cooking tips, weeknight dinner strategies, and so much more. Jenny also offers tips for making vegetarian cooking more of a default on weeknights, as well as for making vegetarian meals appeal to all eaters at the table. We also talk about the power of family rituals, especially around food. We all have rituals in our lives, but sometimes, as Jenny said, we just have to put the goggles on to see them. But when we embrace those rituals, we can discover so much more meaning and joy in our lives. And finally, speaking of joy, we talk about transforming cooking from a chore or just something we have to do into a source of pleasure. If you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you know that that is one of my missions here on this podcast. Also, one of the themes in my book that's coming out next year. How do we make cooking a source of self-care and nourishment in our lives? Well, Jenny offers 3 incredibly simple but profoundly effective tips for helping to make cooking a source of deep pleasure and joy. So definitely stick around for that at the end of the episode. If you enjoy today's episode, I'm wondering if you could do me a quick favor. Could you like the episode over on Substack or share it with your people, share about it on social media, rate it on your podcast app? Each of these easy little quick things go a long way in supporting this ad-free podcast. You can also support it by becoming a subscriber to the Mind, Body, Spirit, Food newsletter, where I dive deeper into some of these topics and I share weekly brand new recipes, all of which just happen to be gluten-free. If you become a paid subscriber for just a few dollars a month, you make this podcast happen. This, as I mentioned, is an ad-free space. It is completely funded by you, my listeners, and I am so deeply grateful for you. Finally, if you're looking for more support in the kitchen, I'm here to help. In my one-on-one coaching and cooking sessions, I work with clients to help them uncover their blocks and their challenges around cooking and eating. We dive into their intuition, uncover their unique digestion, and have fun together. If that work calls for you, if you're looking for a little more pleasure and ease as a cook and or an eater, I would so love to work with you. And you can find out more about those sessions in the show notes. Speaking of which, I'm also going to pop in some of the links to the recipes that we reference. So definitely check those out. All right, my friends, let's go to the show. Hi, Jenny. Welcome to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm going to start by asking you the first question that I ask all of my guests, and that is, what is your cultural upbringing and how has that influenced your relationship to food?
It has had such an enormous impact on my relationship to food because I am the daughter of a Italian mother, 100% Italian mother, and a Jewish father who has roots in Russia and Romania. And obviously both cultures, huge food cultures. And so I grew up in a house that loved food. I mean, not in the traditional way that there was like Shabbat dinners and Sunday gravy, but we just had a real reverence for sitting down together and sharing meals and, just the ritual of eating together and breaking bread.
Did you grow up in the city?
No, I grew up outside of the city in Westchester.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was your journey then to becoming a food writer? Did you always have an interest in food? I mean, it sounds like you did.
I always did, but, I grew up in Westchester. So when I was growing up, if someone said that you could make a living like writing about food, I would have laughed so hard. There are only a few, tracked paths in the world that I grew up in. And so I had a very roundabout way of finding my job. It took me until I was 40, really, to find what I love to do. But I started out, believe it or not, in finance for like a quick 14 months and then realized I just was not for me. And then I was a magazine editor after that, and I loved being a magazine editor. I worked at, Real Simple. I worked at Cookie Magazine. I worked at Bon Appetit. I worked at Martha Stewart. I worked at all the lifestyle biggies. And I really, at heart, I think I'm really a magazine editor. I love that job so much, and it breaks my heart that magazines aren't really around anymore.
Yeah.
But when Cookie folded, that was in 2009, and I decided that I enjoyed writing about food so much, even though I wasn't really doing it as a magazine editor. I was mostly editing food stories, but I was working on a cookbook that Cookie was branding. It was a dinner cookbook, and I just enjoyed it. It was the first time I woke up in the morning and was like, I cannot wait to go to work on this. And so I was like, when that magazine folded, I just thought my kids were young and I wanted to be around more. So I said, I'll just start this blog thing. But at the time, it was 2009. And even then, I was like, I am way too late to the game here because there were already like so many big names. But I just did it anyway. And it turns out it was a good decision.
Yeah.
So that was Dinner Love Story. That's what I launched in 2010. And I've been writing variations, like books and my newsletter, obviously, like ever since.
I love your content. I've always loved your content. Dinner, a Love Story is like the theme of my life. Just that phrase epitomizes everything I love most. In your new book, Get Simple, which I have sitting in front of me, I just love how in the introduction, you start with this delicious description of eating burgers with your family in a vegetarian cookbook, which resonated with me so strongly because I'm a meat eater, but I love vegetarian cooking. We also eat a lot of vegetarian meals during the week. And vegetables are actually my favorite thing to cook.
Oh, wow.
Just because they're so fun, and so versatile.
Yeah.
Well, I know you've shared this story before, but why Weekday Vegetarian? What was the journey to getting there for you and your family?
I mean, really it's funny that you point out that introduction about the burger, because my whole goal with this enterprise is to get people to just start somewhere. And I was like them. I write down everything I eat, and I always have for dinner since 1998, which is a whole nother podcast. But when I looked back, at one point at all of the dinners that I had made for my family, it was so meat heavy and so meat driven. And I'm sure, starting around 2012, 2013, the call for more plant-based eating just became just louder and eventually kind of became too loud to ignore. And, I'm not getting any younger. And I just kind of always had it in my head that I wanted to eat less meat and just, because more vegetables objectively better for you. I mean, unobjectively better for you. And I just figured I live in a house, I cook for a house of meat lovers, and there is no way I could convince them to say goodbye to some of these recipes that have been in my family for generations, like those Italian grandmothers, great grandma Toronto's meatballs, like that's just a staple in our house, and Tony's steak, and they have names, like they all have like names attached to themselves, and unfortunately that was not the case with any vegetarian meals, which it doesn't mean it has to have meat to be memorable, but relationships with food, it's very emotional and nostalgic. And I knew for my own self, not just for my family self, that if it would be very hard for me to become more of a vegetarian eater if I had to say goodbye to those things forever, especially burgers. Like I love
burgers.
A burger.
Me too.
Yeah. So that I kind of was gambling or banking on the fact that other people felt similarly. And I thought this might be a good way in to just get people to start somewhere, like a step up from Meatless Monday. And just let's try to dial back the meat on the week and then save those splurges for the weekend. And eating less meat is the single most important thing you can do as an individual, to help with climate change. So to me, that also felt like something that the conversation around that was obviously getting louder and louder.
Yeah.
And so, it's a long answer, but it wasn't simple and straightforward. It was a long time coming. Yeah. And now it's like, it's a lifestyle, and I'm so used to the way I eat now. And I know you didn't ask this, but I do feel like it's not like, oh, it's Monday, I'm not having any meat today. It's not like that anymore. It's more just that my default is no meat. And whenever I can, if I'm out or, if the option is chickpeas instead of chicken, then I'll do the chickpeas. And if I'm at some like amazing restaurant that's famous for its ossobuco or whatever, I'll have that. But for the most part, I try to keep my default mode on plant-based and vegetarian.
I love that so much because people can get so dogmatic. And then all of a sudden, like it becomes punitive. Like I have to eat vegetarian on the weekdays. But what you're saying is just start small. It's almost like habit building. And then once the habit is there where, you like for me, I automatically wake up, get my lemon water and meditate. I don't think about it. It happens. It's part of my life. And the same thing, I'm sure, with vegetarian eating, especially for people who want to make that more of a default, but then not to maybe be so harsh about it as well. Like allow for allowances and allow life to be life.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect is the enemy of good.
Oh, yes. I also love that you write down all your meals. So I used to do this when we had people over. I had a red notebook and I would write down all the menus. And then these days I jot out my menu on the back of our grocery list, but that grocery list gets discarded eventually. But I think it would be so fascinating to go back and to see what we're cooking and what we're making. I think it's a useful tool. I do that for our Sunday night suppers. I do make a note of what we eat for Sunday because it's always a big deal. But even just for the weeknight meals, like what is resonating, what's not? Is there something that I can see we're just in this rut of eating that over and over again? I think that's such a great tool that people can try.
It's really, I have to say, it's a little, pathological on some level because I've been doing it for so long and I don't even really know why I started. But the theory that I've always had is just that, like with all writing and journaling, you just kind of feel like, oh, I'm spending so much time doing X, Y, and Z. And especially thinking about dinner, like my husband and I, we would like talk about dinner and we still do from the moment we wake up. We're like, what do we do for dinner tonight? Because it feels like this kind of North Star at the end of the day. And like, you're just like, for me, it's always been, okay, if I can get to dinner. And I think that's just from growing up in a house like that. And so we would just spend so much time thinking about it that it felt weird for it to be gone as soon as it happened. And so I just kind of started writing down what we ate. And it became, as you said, very useful as a reference, not just to see eating patterns. That didn't really come out until later, but more just like ideas. It's like the most seasonal cookbook you can think of because I'm like, oh, after a few years, you see what you've been making all spring long, for the last 4 springs. And it becomes easy to think, oh, I'll make that, that spring pasta or whatever. And I do what you do. I write down menus for people who are coming over because, in spite of having written probably thousands of recipes, I still, when people come over, I have my formulas. It's so funny. And I'm like, oh, I will 100% cook the same thing for someone if I don't check that. And no one will get arrested. But it's just like, it feels like I could do a little bit better. But I'm always curious, like what go-to entertaining menus people have. Like,
oh my gosh.
What's yours? I want to hear yours.
You know what? We do a lot of entertaining in the summer because we have a pool. So our friends are like, we're coming over.
Nice.
And for us, I love smoking. We have a smoker, and that's kind of my joy in the summer is to get the smoker going and just literally maybe there's eggplants, maybe there's a pork shoulder, maybe, whatever it is that's on the grill or on the smoker. In the winter, or I would say, except for that situation in the summer where we're all outside kind of hanging, in the winter, I'm always doing things that can be almost entirely made ahead as far as the main dish goes. I just like the ease of when people come to not be stressing at the stovetop. So a lot of braises and stews and,
Yeah. And those also make the house smell so good when they walk in.
It's true.
Yeah.
Now, I find it's really easy for my family to eat vegetarian in the summer. We have a farm share. We have a garden. We are like inundated with fresh produce.
I want to live with you.
Come over. In the winter, it gets a little more challenging. I was just wondering if you have any tips this time of year, because this episode is airing in mid-January, and we're kind of entering that, for me, that downward slope of like, how do I get excited again in the kitchen?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I'm with you. I don't know if this is advice at all, but you have to embrace your cabbages. That's what I say. I love cabbage and all kinds of cabbage, from like Brussels sprouts to green cabbage to Napa to red to anything. I'm kind of a recent convert. Like I used to only really think of it as slaw in the summer. And then maybe like when I started this whole vegetarian thing, I just became obsessed with roasting it and sauteing it and caramelizing it. And it really is a completely different vegetable. And it's my default for all salads in the winter. Like last night, you can tell I'm a little bit sick. So I wasn't really eating that much, but my daughter's home. And I was like, I don't really feel like cooking, but I had a head of Napa cabbage and a pre-shredded red cabbage. And so I just shredded the Napa with the red cabbage and then added a little chicken from like that was left over. And I made a ginger dressing with like sesame seeds. It was a miso ginger dressing. And then I added like sesame seeds, avocado, peanuts, whatever. And I had the chicken left over, which is why I used it. I think if I was making that dinner for my family or for me, I would have roasted tofu and put it in there. But that meal right there that I just described is like my go-to default, like healthy weeknight dinner, and it can be, when you're converting kids into this vegetarian thing, it's a really helpful recipe to have in your rotation because you can substitute in the protein, whatever you want. You can have chicken or shrimp or tofu. And to me, I actually love it the most with tofu. So yeah. And it's really filling, especially with the avocado in there. And if you add a little peanut butter to the dressing, it becomes a little richer. So there are all kinds of ways to make that just like really substantial and delicious. But yeah, so that's like a winter salad where the vegetables are they're the star. And that's a raw cabbage, So it's like you're adding, in my book, I have those dressings, those like miso ginger dressing and the spicy peanut and the tahini, and those dressings just like upgrade vegetables in a way. Like you can have, you could put those dressings on shoe leather and they would taste good, And so that's one way.
Well, I love that framework where you have this go-to. That's for me. I mean, I wrote a book about bowls, build a bowl when my kids were young because we found ourselves eating down to their levels. And I was like, okay, back up. I'm still craving tons of flavor and texture. A bowl became the framework where we could adapt and build according to what we have. So even last night, I have a newsletter article about our Monday night falafel bowls because I have frozen falafels in the freezer at all times. And they're like my fallback when we have nothing to eat. And it becomes this clean out the fridge dinner where if we have quinoa in the freezer, we had roasted beets, we had roasted broccoli, added cucumbers and olives and some arugula, like so random, but with the sauce, the creamy tahini sauce, which again, you could drizzle over anything.
Yeah.
You can adapt that framework in a million different ways, just like your cabbage salad.
Yes. And I think that's important when you're trying to convert kids to not just vegetarian eating, but just, quote, grown-up eating. If you're not cooking to the lowest common denominator, you're just showing them the way it's, supposed to be eaten or the way they'll eventually get it, exposures and all that. But they see the way mom is eating it and dad's eating it, and they'll be more likely to try that the next time or the next time. And
I love it.
That's a good strategy. I like that.
I want to stay on cabbage for a minute because I do want to go through some other winter vegetables. I think this is so helpful for people who are like, okay, January, we got all these cabbages. I, like you, love roasting cabbage. And I often do, even like you said, sauteing cabbage until it's really caramelized and tossing that with pasta with maybe like either caramelized mushrooms or bacon if we're going in a meat direction. What do you love to do with roasted cabbage?
With roasted cabbage, I can literally just toss it like big, not shred it, but just, maybe cut a green cabbage or a red cabbage into like large pieces. Toss it with olive oil and salt and pepper and roast it, and then make like with one of those dressings. That's just like a perfect side dish, like a roasted cabbage. When I want to make it the center of the dinner table, I mean, there's a recipe. I think it's on my Substack. I make this all the time. It's like a galette with roasted cabbage and caramelized onions, and you can put any kind of cheese on that you want. But that's just like, it's so hearty and wintry, and it makes the house smell amazing. And I mean, I do feel like having a pie dough at the ready is kind of crucial for any kind of vegetable forward dinner.
I just had a podcast with Lucas Folger last fall, and he talked about a Brussels sprouts galette, and it like wouldn't leave me alone. That little, in a recipe idea like gets in there.
What was it?
Well, he just mentioned that he loves putting Brussels sprouts in a galette, and then eventually, a few months ago, it's in my newsletter as well. The Brussels sprouts galette, using just shaved Brussels sprouts that you toss with cheese and then they roast up as they cook, so you don't have to cook them ahead of time. But you can do this with a million different vegetables, like like stuff in roasted squash or roasted cabbage and onions.
Yeah. Can we talk about Brussels sprouts a little bit?
Yes, let's talk about Brussels sprouts.
Because I guess that's technically cabbage too. It's not roasting, but I have to say my most favorite way to make Brussels sprouts, which is new. Like I used to always roast them and toss them with like some kind of a dressing. You're picking up a theme here, I'm sure. But I went to Buvette in New York a couple months ago, and they had a shaved Brussels sprout salad there that was raw Brussels sprouts. And I didn't order it because to me, raw Brussels sprouts didn't sound like very appealing, but someone else at the table ordered it, and it quickly became my obsession. And it was a very easy salad to replicate at home, but you basically shave the Brussels sprouts like feathery thin, which can be a little perilous if you're using a mandolin, but as long as you're wearing your protector, it's fine. But it gets like very like light and feathery. And then you add walnuts and pecorino and currants, or any kind of sweetness. Like I've used apples too. And then with like a really simple, like good olive oil and lemon juice. And it's so addictive. I always describe it to people and they're like, yeah, whatever. And then when they try it, it's just one of those things where the sum is greater than the parts. And I even made a version for Thanksgiving this year instead of roasting Brussels sprouts. And everyone was very skeptical, but I'm proud to say that it made the lineup for next year. We voted and it's in. It's in.
I first had a version of that at Ferrani's in Brooklyn, which was a pizza place back in the day when we lived in Brooklyn. And it blew my mind. It was just... I think the key here for that salad is like good quality olive oil, good shaved pecorino or Parmesan, and then just the lemon juice. And then you can play with it as you go. But you're right, it changes this vegetable that you thought you knew. All of a sudden you're like, wait a minute.
But I mean, honestly, I use the Trader Joe's Brussels sprouts, the organic Brussels sprouts that come in the bag. And so, I do use very good pecorino and olive oil, but like I think pretty much all of that salad, the rest of it comes from Trader Joe's. So it's it's just weirdly, I don't know, I would have never predicted how addicted to it I would have become. I also, with Brussels sprouts, I like putting them on a baking sheet with gnocchi and tossing them with olive oil, and that's just like an easy pasta meal, and then add it, with like red chili flakes and parm or pecorino. It's like the easiest baking sheet dinner in one bowl. And
that's similar to the pasta I was talking about with the cabbage. We'll do the same thing with sliced Brussels sprouts, is saute them and toss them with spaghetti with garlic and shallots or whatever we have. Finish it with some lemon juice and Parmesan. And it's just like, that's an easy way, like you're describing, to bring a vegetable like Brussels sprouts into the main dish. Because I think it's like, myself included, I always just like, my go-to is just the side dish. Like they're just the side dish. I know. Incorporate into the main.
Hetty McKinnon has a recipe for, it sounds like something like one of your go-tos, like it's spaghetti with cabbage And then she makes like a miso carbonara with it. I don't think she uses an egg. I think she just uses miso with hot water. And it's a vegan carbonara with cabbage and noodles. I've been meaning to make that forever.
Yeah.
So.
What about potatoes?
For some reason, I don't think of like yellow or gold potatoes or red potatoes as like the center of the table kind of vegetable, but a sweet potato or a Japanese sweet potato, like I'll roast sweet potatoes and then make a miso butter with scallions and drizzle that on top. But as a main dish, I have to say I have to work on that. There's a void in my repertoire on centering a dinner around potatoes. But
we'll do like stuffed sweet potatoes and then you can stuff them with a million different things. You could go, like my kids love them with chili and, cheese and all this. My husband and I love doing roasted chickpeas with greens and tahini sauce on top. But you're right. I guess for us, even potatoes aren't usually, except for in that way, they're not usually the center of our meal.
I also feel like people know how to make potatoes taste delicious.
Yeah,
so it's one of those things. It's not hard to like, you just mash them and they're amazing, or roast them. You don't really need to do the hard sell on them the way you do with like kale and Brussels sprouts and cabbage. And so you don't have to work as hard. I don't know. That's just a theory.
This is like reminding me that anytime if I want to make a meal feel fancy, even if it's a Tuesday night, mashed potatoes are a great base for anything. So even if you're doing a bunch of roasted vegetables on top with like any kind of sauce that you're talking about, or even like pesto, or obviously you could do just olive oil and lemon juice, but that becomes kind of a main course. It's part of it.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
And I have to bring back up miso because we've mentioned it a few times. And I think it's like the past 2 years, I've become obsessed with miso paste. I have so many recipes in my newsletter right now with miso. But because I think it's maybe one of the best friends of hearty winter vegetables. Yeah. What do you like to do with miso?
Well, it's also the best friend of people who are trying to get away from using animal fat for flavor. I do feel like it's one of those umami boosters that once you discover it, you're like, just like that recipe that I was just telling you about, the Hetty McKinnon recipe, like she clearly, that miso is as satisfying as bacon fat. It really is. Like I use it in dressings, obviously. I use it, let me think about this. I mean, it's so funny. I use it in everything and I can't think of a single thing.
I just started adding it to mashed potatoes and that was a game changer, like to stir in a tablespoon or two. And you can't, it's kind of just like, wait, what has happened? What has just happened to these mashed potatoes? Because it's not like overpowering. It just adds this umami savoriness that's so good.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I do feel like it's always that ingredient that is doing that, where you're like, why does this taste so good? And it's because of miso.
Yeah. So one more vegetable that I love, well, it's kind of a lot of vegetables, but any kind of hearty greens. Do you cook with a lot of greens?
This time of year, kale and chard for sure. I love a kale salad more than anything. I have for 20 years, not just once I became a weekday vegetarian. Yeah, I'll throw it. I like it shredded, I don't like kind of big, thick leaves of kale, but yeah, I'll toss it into a slaw just to have a little more like of that dark green color. It looks so pretty. I'll roast like a delicata squash and slice it and add that to a kale salad with pickled red onions, and the colors are so beautiful. That's like a favorite winter salad because you think that you can't really get that kind of color in January, and you're like, oh, I actually can. Like, you know what? Like when pickled red onions look like so vibrant and purple against like the yellow, the really golden flesh of a delicata, or just a butternut squash. I know it's not quite the season for those, but you can usually find something. And then the kale with that deep, beautiful green. So I love doing that. There's a kale salad that I make pretty much anytime someone comes over with pomegranates. I add pomegranates and red onion, and then I make a dressing that just has, like, it's just a pretty straightforward dressing with sherry vinegar and a little bit of pomegranate molasses that gives it a little bit of depth. And that with kale, I do feel like kale needs a little bit of sweetness, just kind of like cabbage does. And so that's my go-to. And it's the recipe that people always ask me for the next day, even if it's just, it's so simple and deceptively simple, but it is about that pomegranate molasses. So
That's such a secret ingredient that I always have in my pantry too. And even when I was talking about making bowls earlier, or I have a recipe for grilled vegetables, like just a drizzle of the pomegranate molasses and a drizzle of tahini. You don't even have to make the tahini sauce.
Yeah.
It adds that sweet tart balance, which is so good. And I love how you brought up collard greens, because I think so many people don't know what to do with collard greens. And
did I bring up collard greens?
You mentioned collard greens, but
I don't think I did. I think I said colored greens. Did I say colored? Okay. Because I don't know what to do with collard greens. I'm like your readers.
My husband, we just had a dinner party for his birthday, and it was a meat heavy dinner. It was his choice. Mm-hmm. It was a smoked pork butt. He's from Atlanta, so I went in like a Southern kind of theme, but everyone was like, what are these greens? And they're so easy to make. So you just basically cook them like any other greens. Start with garlic and shallots. If you want to add bacon, you can. And then you add broth, either vegetable broth or chicken broth. And you just keep adding broth until the greens are super silky and tender, and they're just luscious. And then I always finish it with a dash of hot sauce and some apple cider vinegar.
Amazing. Yeah, I love collard greens. I just don't ever make them in my own home, but I always order them.
I put them in soups as well. Like I have a peanut and sweet potato stew, and I will slice them up and add them to the stew, just like you would finish it with kale or spinach or something like that.
Right. Yeah, that sounds amazing.
What are some of your other like go-to weeknight dinners this time of year?
Most of the time, if I'm like just stuck with something, beans are such a default for our house now, and chickpeas in particular. But
I love that you brought that up.
The other night we had, I just like even a can of pinto beans. Like there's a recipe for this in my first volume of the Weekday Vegetarians, but they're just like sweet and smoky pinto beans that you just add, smoked paprika and some vinegar and to like a can of beans. It's a little bit more than that with a little tomato paste just to give it a little something. So that's just the center of like a delicious weeknight bowl. So you can add rice and avocado and cheese or lettuce or some kind of salsa, and it's just such a no-brainer go-to, and everyone loves it. And again, if you have a holdout at the table, you can add chicken or you can add pork or whatever you need to do. And then we'll do just more on the beans. Like we'll have the Rancho Gordo lima beans, the white lima beans. They're on the cover of my first book for a reason, because we just fell in love with them so hard during COVID, during the pandemic. I just dump a bag of them into a medium pot in the morning and soak them all day. I don't touch them. And then at 6 o'clock, I don't even empty. I know you're supposed to strain the water and then put them back into the water, but I don't even do that. I just turn on the heat and I add a little olive oil and herbs and onion, kind of whatever I have. And then I simmer them. And then I serve them with like a little bit of burrata and pesto and crusty bread. And it's better than any like animal protein centered meal. I mean, maybe not a burger, but like close to almost anything. And it's so stewy, especially this time of year in the winter. It's just like having a pot of beans on the stove just feels so good. And I love that meal. And then frittatas, we make frittatas all the time. I think this time of year, you can use kale and onions, and in the spring I do asparagus. And it's just, I mean, I'm not inventing the wheel here, but it's such an easy vegetarian fallback.
Yeah.
And it comes together so fast, which I love.
We have a book coming out next year, but I have a chapter that's all clean out the fridge. And I have a recipe called Thursday Night Frittata, because I used to do my grocery shopping on Fridays. And it was just every Thursday, okay, let's pull out all the little nubbins in the fridge, the leftover, saute up the veggies, or even if there's leftover cooked beans or whatever, like it would all go in the frittata.
Yeah.
Such a good way to use up all the odds and ends.
Such a great way. Yeah.
One thing that you recently, I should say I think it was November, you had a newsletter all about family ritual, or you mentioned family ritual. And I've written quite a bit about ritual and had a podcast with behavior scientist Michael Norton all about the power of ritual. And you mentioned how important it is for your family, especially now that you're empty nesters and your girls are gone, that you keep creating ritual. I would love to know how ritual plays a role within your family, and what are some of your rituals around food?
I wrote a book called How to Celebrate Everything about 10 years ago. And it was all about the role that rituals play in our families' lives. And in particular, the way food just infuses a moment with like that nostalgia and meaning. And, you know, it's like some of our most special rituals are the rituals that are so personal to us that I always say, you know, like the most important thing is like you find your own rituals. They're probably right in front of you. And it's just putting on those goggles and looking for them. Like we used to always make mashed potatoes for my daughters when they'd have a braces tightening session. And I didn't even really know it was a ritual until someone was like, are we having mashed potatoes tonight? You know, so like even that qualifies as a ritual. But, you know, obviously there are rituals that are more traditional or annual, like, you know, for the holidays, we'll make latkes and decorate the tree at the same time because I'm Jewish and my husband's not. And, you know, like in the summer, we'll walk to the farmer's market every Saturday, you know, whoever's around. As the kids got older, it was usually just my husband and me. But, you know, in the summer, in August, we would collect everything we needed for tomato sandwiches and come back and make a big tomato sandwich lunch, you know, just all these little things, you know, it's hard. It's so important. And especially now, we lived in the same house for 20 years where we raised our children in a suburb of New York. And then we moved to the city when they graduated. And so now when they come home, I'm feeling like a little anchorless, like because so many of those rituals had to do with where we were. And I do feel like, oh, I have to create those rituals. Like I need my children to feel grounded and to feel like this is their new home. And it's like just been a struggle for me to try to figure that out. But really, you know, the food helps so much with that because, you know, like there's this, I don't even know how to describe this, but there were nights when the kids were growing up on Saturday nights. Like my favorite Saturday night was not like going out with friends or having people over, but just like when we all found ourselves at home, like with nothing really to do. And we would just go off on dinner and just like have a great cocktail and play really good music. And it was just something that happened over the course of, you know, 2 decades. And when they were both home over Thanksgiving, we had a Saturday night like that. And it just made me realize like, oh, this is good. This is the same vibe, even though we're in a totally different house. It felt good. So yeah.
I love that you said that. I mean, it's so true. Anything can become a ritual. In fact, Michael Norton, who is a, you know, PhD behavior scientist, one of his rituals is to put candles and meatloaf for his kids. Like so random. But I just had a holiday special in December and we talked about tradition. And for me, tradition, the actions are so important, but often it's just creating the vibe. And you just said that. Like for us, for the holidays, what I was talking about in the holiday special was it's not necessarily the things we do, but it's that atmosphere that we create around the holidays. And for my family, it's Sunday night supper. We do that every Sunday. We light the candles, but it's not even about that. It's just about us all being home and cooking and being together, and what we're making and all of that stuff doesn't really matter. It's about the atmosphere and the vibe.
Yeah. No, totally. And I think, as I said, you know, when I wrote that book, a lot of people were like, oh my God, I don't have any family rituals. Like my kids are not going to remember anything. And I just was so adamant about that. Like just put those goggles on and look around and listen to what your kids are saying and look at the way you feel. Like pay attention to that in moments when not at like, you know, graduation or at Thanksgiving, not at the big events, but in the everyday. It's just about intentional living, really. Yeah.
I just have one more question that I just want to touch on really quickly, because this is something I always bring up because it's one of my missions, I guess, with my readers is to help them see or experience cooking as pleasure instead of cooking as a chore. And I'm just wondering if you have any tips for making that mental shift for people who might think of cooking as just like, oh, this thing they have to do.
Yeah, I get this question a lot. And I was just having lunch with someone yesterday who said his New Year's resolution is exactly that, to see cooking as a source of joy. And what I always say to people is that when you think about cooking, like there are many parts of getting a meal on the table or getting a meal in front of you, right? It's like you have to think about what you want to make. You have to check to see if you have all the ingredients for it. And if not, you have to go shopping for it. And then you have to actually do the cooking and then you clean up, right? So like that's like 4 main parts of the process, right? So the cooking I think most people, that's the part that people really want to learn how to enjoy. And that's the creative part. For me, that's definitely the case. So anything you can do around the other parts, I feel like are going to help. Like for me, I'm not a baker. I really wish that I was a baker. And so like, I've just like decided I haven't really baked a really good batch of cookies this holiday season yet. I know like it's by the time this comes out, it's January, but it's the same thing. Like I love the way the house smells when I've baked something. And so I want to do it and I want to find joy in it. And so I'll just make sure all the ingredients are ready for me. I'll have someone else choose the recipe, like just all the things that are like that you can outsource. Like when I was cooking for young kids, I remember talking about this a lot. And like so much of the stress around cooking is figuring out what to make. Yeah. So if you can outsource that, and then, the shopping, I don't know. I mean, if you can get your groceries delivered, and I personally like to shop, so that's not a part of it that really holds me back. But I know for a lot of people, it really sucks the joy out of it. And so just like eliminating any part of the process and getting someone else to clean up, and that's where you start. And then the thing about cooking and probably baking is that it's addictive. Like once you do it once and once you feed someone and obviously it goes without saying that you should probably not pick the most elaborate meals to start out with, because that is the quickest way to never cook again. I mean, you want to make sure, like if you put a little bit of effort and get like this beautiful meal, starting with beautiful ingredients, then you're more likely to cook the next night. If you make like a ottolenghi recipe that requires you to hunt down like 17 different spices and herbs, and then, like takes 10 different pots and pans, like you're not going to want to do that the next night, and that's not really what cooking is about. That's not the way most people cook. That's certainly not the way chefs cook when they're at home. Right. And so just like picking very strategic, simple recipes.
Those are such good tips to streamline all of the things around cooking, which can be sometimes the biggest roadblocks. So if you can find ways to simplify all of that so that once you arrive in the kitchen, you have the ingredients, then you can start the music, you can get into your senses, and you can maybe, enjoy the process more, which I love.
Yes. Everyone has to figure out, what part of it they like the most. But I agree. That's the part that is the most rewarding for me.
All right. I have to say thank you. This episode is so packed with inspiration, and thank you for coming on, even though I know you're sick. You're a star.
You're so welcome. I love talking to you.
I do have one last question, but it's a really quick one, and it's how I close all of my shows. And that is, if it's your last meal on earth, what would it be in this minute?
Bread and butter. Real, like a perfect version, like a beautiful, like warm, just out of the oven, crusty bread and like French butter with like just, just the best quality of each ingredient and just like still warm. And that's nothing better.
Thank you so much, Jenny.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. If this work resonates with you in any way, you can support it by leaving a review or comment or sharing it with friends. Also, you can sign up for the newsletter, Mind, Body, Spirit, Food. And by becoming a paid member for just $5 a month, you help fund this entire project. Thank you so much to all of you who are already subscribed, especially to those paid subscribers. This work could not happen without you. I'm Nikki Sizemore, and as always, remember to nourish yourself with intention and love.